Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Mike McCarty, CEO of Safe Hiring, Safe Ministry Solutions. Couple real quick housekeeping items. We've got a large audience today, so we have everybody muted, cuts down on a lot of background noise. So if you have a question, if you just use the Zoom chat, you can ask a question or the Q&A area. And when we get to the end of the webinar here in about 30 minutes, we'll try to go through and answer any questions you have. Also give you some contact information at the end for questions that may come up after you think about it for a little bit. But just want to thank everybody for joining us. A little bit on my background. Grew up in a family of law enforcement, graduated from college. Nobody thought I was going into law enforcement. Ended up becoming a police officer in Nashville, Tennessee. Back in the early 90s, we were really looking at a significant problem in our community, but it was nationwide. We had a lot of domestic homicides, a lot of people being killed by people that said at some point they had loved them. And so we started looking into the data and the numbers. And in about 1994, I helped start what became the largest community-based domestic violence prevention program in the United States. And so through that, we reduced the domestic murder rate by more than 50%. With that, I left Nashville, started doing a lot of work for Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Violence Against Women Office, Department of Homeland Security when it was formed in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and ended up starting Safe Hiring Solutions 16 years ago. It's a background screening firm. We work with 7,000 or 8,000 organizations around the country. We do a lot of different things these days, which we'll get into some of this as we go. What I also want to mention is, what we're getting ready to talk about here with this most recent church incident in Texas. This is not to cast any kind of judgment. It's an evaluation. And by that, what we're doing is just looking at, are there any things we can learn? And I'm getting ready to introduce Paul and let him introduce himself, actually. But we both come out of these law enforcement backgrounds, and part of this is, really learning through incidents, what are things that we can take as lessons to use to hopefully prevent something like this from happening again. We applied this to fatality reviews when children were killed, when adults were killed, especially in domestic or child abuse. We were trying to figure out what are the connecting factors, what are things that we can teach our team so it doesn't happen again. So that's the approach here today. It's really looking at lessons that we can take away from this. What are some conversations that cause us to think about things and the way we're doing them and make us better at what we do, and hopefully in the long term, prevent incidents from happening in our church or organization. Paul, wanted to kick it over to you and let you introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Okay, Mike, thank you. And hello to everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Dvorak. I'm a retired Secret Service agent and retired after 23 years, was on President George W. Bush's detail, and then helped organize several big events like United Nations General Assembly in New York for 3 years, and was on our Dignitary Protective division, and so followed heads of state, heads of government, led their security as well, and finished off in Indianapolis, and currently working in corporate security right now. The way I met Mike was about 4 or 5 years ago at a seminar that he gave regarding background checks, and I was really impressed with his methodology and how they carried it out. And from our experience in law enforcement, we saw a lot of these companies really kind of cutting corners and charging people a pretty exorbitant amount of money for what they received. And unfortunately, I thought that, these these companies that ordered up these backgrounds, they really didn't even know what they were getting. They didn't know the type of questions that they should be asking. So it was refreshing to see a company out there that were, I think, supplying people with a good product at a fair price. And so, so from that point, we became friends. And, obviously, know many of you probably have read some of the publications the Secret Service has put out. So we've been heavily involved in, school safety. And so toward the end of my career, which I just retired a little less than 2 years ago, we were going around giving seminars to schools and, even doing some walkthroughs, which I've, since done plenty with Mike. So, that was really rewarding for me to go through and try to help some of these schools out, knowing that they don't have a lot of money, for budget security functions in their school. And it's kind of carried over to churches as well, just because for a lot of the same reasons and a lot of the same difficulties they have in securing environments that really need to be open. They're welcoming. That's their aspect of their business. But in the same sense, we need to have a secure environment. So it's a very, very difficult tightrope to walk. And so anyways, that's kind of where we got involved. And, I'm happy for this presentation and to help out any questions at the end.
All right. Thanks, Paul. So as we kind of look at the incident that happened in Texas, interesting enough, I did not schedule this webinar on Inauguration Day because we're trying to make any kind of political statement, because I can tell you right now, absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. There is nothing about what we're going to talk about that has anything to do with whether should not be armed. What we're going to talk about are kind of the facts that what happened here, and maybe some things to think about, especially if you don't come out of a law enforcement background, just some things to think about from this particular incident that may help in the future if you were to find yourself in a situation like this. So, kind of relying on the media like most of us are right now, because this happened, just a few weeks ago. But kind of the highlight of what we know that, you had a perpetrator brandishing a shotgun out of a car, a high-speed pursuit. It either fled or wrecked right on or near the church property. And the perpetrator gets into the church and hides, and perimeter is set up. But after a while, the law enforcement officers believe that he has escaped the perimeter somehow, that he's no longer inside this perimeter. And so the next morning, the pastor and his wife, and I believe another employee, come to church. One good note or aside to this is I think they were virtual. And so there were no members present. And so the number of people that potentially could have been involved in this was lessened significantly. But he finds this perpetrator hiding in a bathroom and orders him to the floor. The pastor's armed. I understand that may have got distracted, was talking to his wife, and the suspect overtakes him, disarms him, and then murders him. And, just as a side note, we know this was not a religious attack. And so, as we really just kind of look at the high end of this particular incident, just like I mentioned, we're just kind of trying to review and say, are there things we can learn, lessons to help us if we find ourselves in a similar situation, in the future. I've talked about a couple of the models, debriefing and fatality reviews, gathering the facts. A couple questions I had right out of the gate, did the pastor know of this incident that had happened in the community and literally could have been on their property? And I don't know the answer to that. I know when we work with public schools, Paul and I've been all over the place. And as we're working with public schools, there's a lot of things we factor into security and communication and, especially in urban environments where we're working with school districts, it's the communication with law enforcement. If you got a robbery, you've got an incident, something happening in a community, and maybe it's 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and making sure that the school district received that information. They may have to do a lockdown. They may not be able to send kids out to the bus because the things that happen in the community can have an impact on the safety of that school or that organization. So, curious, how much information the pastor may have had that morning going into the church, and whether or not there was any kind of policy. Was the church open? Was it unlocked? And, we say, does it really matter? I mean, I grew up in a small community. Our churches were not locked. We had 3 churches in the small town I grew up in. I've told people wasn't uncommon, even as a young kid being running around the community playing hide and seek, to end up hiding, going inside the church. The doors were always open or unlocked. But understanding, was it locked? Could there have been any kind of indication if they had to break in? Just a couple questions, from the top as we kind of look at this. I would also, and Paul, I know this is something you could really talk to, especially, is really looking at when you are engaging with somebody, creating space. I know from a law enforcement perspective, we spend a lot of time on spacing. When I was in uniform, inside a home, there were lots of things we were doing to try to create space and give us an advantage, and, getting people seated, and just, things that you would do. And I tell civilians all the time, most of the time your only interaction with a law enforcement officer is going to be on a traffic stop. And the things that you see on a traffic stop, sometimes you go, well, that officer was rude. And what does rude mean? Highly professional, maybe, curt, seems very tactical. But as they approach a vehicle, that is a very dangerous position for them because they don't know who they're interacting with. They may have stopped you for a taillight, but how many times have we seen cases where a taillight out turns into something completely differently? So, it's that creating space, and also understanding that not everybody's going to submit to a firearm. Violent offenders, could be mental health. Think of the proliferation in suicide and suicidal ideations over the last 10 or 11 months during COVID. If you look at any of the statistics out there, we've had a huge increase in mental health issues related to the lockdowns and everything surrounding that. So, again, just having a firearm doesn't necessarily mean somebody's going to submit to a firearm like maybe it looks like they do in the movies. And I would just say, as a civilian, which I am today, my job's not to apprehend. And so it's okay to retreat. It's okay to be a good witness. We did this a lot with off-duty officers when I was still an active police officer, detective. We were required to be armed when we were off duty. But there were times you were in a situation out of uniform, off duty, that you would be a better witness than trying to intervene at that particular moment. By intervening could have caused more danger to yourself or to others. And so, being a good witness, not being afraid to retreat. And a lot of times we have no idea what we're dealing with or what people are capable of in positions like this. Paul, you got some perspective, especially being in plain clothes, most of your career. Things you want to add here?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Mike. I mean, a couple other things, and it's kind of interesting. Anybody in law enforcement, I'm sure, has been asked, about folks wanting to get a gun and carry it for personal. And my response, and I think a lot of officers' response, is really the same: is, if you pull that weapon out, what are you willing to do? And that's a big question. And I know folks that I have asked that question to, they immediately decided, what, maybe a gun isn't for me. So in this case, and I don't, just like you said, Mike, I don't know what the exact circumstances in this case, but creating distance is huge. But you have to know your limitations and you have to know what you're willing to do, because you can talk to somebody and try to de-escalate, which is always very, very, it's highly recommended as your first choice. But like Mike said, you don't know if you're dealing with somebody who has mental issues, and it's very, very difficult to try to rationalize with folks in those circumstances. But if you get to a point where you feel like you have to, pull out a weapon to protect yourself, well, then you have to be very prepared, to pull that trigger if necessary. And you need to know your limitations of what situation you can deal with. And I'm not trying to Monday morning quarterback this situation, but I think it's just important, and to go through and in the morning, like Mike said, to make sure that the church is safe, if at all possible. And I know it isn't possible all the times, but if you could go around with another individual to do that, that would be something that I would recommend as well. It's, two people walking around, if there was another person, in that situation, they may have been able to de-escalate it, because that person maybe would have thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to get this weapon from this individual. So they may take directions much easier if you have another person there. But those are just a couple thoughts, Mike.
I appreciate it. And I think, the question is, and you may have answered this question already within your congregation, but it just may cause pause to kind of think through, if you've answered yes or you've answered no. And there's no right answer here. I put a note down here at the bottom, you think back, I think it was toward the end of 2019, another incident in Texas where the assailant come into the church. I believe he had a sawed-off shotgun, and one of the members of the church was also a reserve deputy and a firearms instructor. So, we'll talking about training on here, but a single headshot and basically, eliminated that threat and probably saved multiple lives. So it's just really to cause you to pause and think about these questions and, make sure, understand everything surrounding what it means to be armed. I know for 26 weeks in the training academy, the thing that was, kind of drilled into my consciousness was, you are an armed police officer. So every time you walk into a situation, there is a firearm. And so being able to think about and control and maintain that firearm was paramount in our thinking. And that was very different when I was in uniform, because, back then we had these level 3 holsters. I don't know what maybe they call them today, but would have been very difficult to disarm me, especially from behind, unless you really knew what you were doing and you were fast and good. But then I moved into plain clothes, which was a little bit different. So now we're talking more like what we're going to see in a church environment, right? I'm in a suit and tie, or I'm in plain clothes. I'm carrying, on an ankle holster or in a pocket, or, a pancake holster. And so thinking through being able to, maintain possession or control of that firearm in the event that you have to pull that firearm. But then I go to training. There's a lot of training, but, what we see, and a good friend of mine's been a school resource officer for a long time, and we were having this exact conversation because so many states have moved toward allowing school employees to potentially become armed, and, different requirements from state to state. But as we're having the conversation, one thing we were talking about as police officers, even going through 26 weeks in the training academy in Nashville, they could put us into so many situations in the academy that mimicked real life. But at the end of the day, we knew we were in a training environment. We were going home that day. So we really never knew, even a police officer that had been recruited, gone through a long selection process, been through incredible training, we never really knew how any of them, including myself, were going to react until you got dipped in hot water. And so, sometimes when we're seeing training, where they may have a lot of experience on a shooting range, it's very different than when you've got an active, fast moving incident. I think this example in White Settlement, if I remember correctly, I want to think it was like 60 seconds almost from start to finish when that incident started and ended inside that church. So thinking through some of the training, you may be able to engage with local law enforcement that may be able to create, more of a tactical training opportunity. I've seen that, especially if your security team involves members of your local law enforcement community, which should also include some weapon retention training as well, not just, static targets and firearm training. Being able to manage your own stress, it's one thing, on a gun range to be, shooting. It's another thing when you've got real live high blood, blood pressure being elevated, you're tunneling in, you're trying to manage the stress and control a situation. And then training on de-escalation. I think Paul mentioned this just a second ago when you're looking at, I'll be honest with you, I always felt like in most situations I was in as a police officer, my mouth served me better than anything I had on my utility belt. I was better at talking. I could talk, and you get people talking. Doesn't mean everybody's going to respond to it, because I can give you two examples where they didn't. And I actually had a friend that was killed in one of our cases. So, but being able to, have that as a tool to be able to help de-escalate situations. And so, making sure our training matches for our security teams a lot of this complexity in the event that they would have some kind of incident that they would have to deal with like this. Paul, anything you want to add on this slide?
Yeah, just a couple quick things. All law enforcement always stress this, but have a plan. And like you can go through tabletop exercises or real exercises in the church. The advantage that you have is that your church, where all the doors lead to, how you can get into your church. So, you can role play through that stuff. If someone came through a door, what is going to be, the folks on your security team, what is going to be their response? How are you going to position yourselves? Because, you don't want to, be friendly fire, crossfire, all of that kind of stuff. So if you can kind of role play through those different scenarios and you have an idea of where other people are going to be and what their reaction is, it is extremely beneficial. The other aspect of this in a church is, depending on where your church is, you could have parishioners that are carrying weapons too. You need to know who those people are, and you need to know where they're seated. And if you're going to allow it, my suggestion is I would make sure that they sit in the same place every week. I mean, it could be an advantage to you if you trust them and they can be part of your security team. But if they're not, you want to make sure where they are, and you want to make sure what they're going to do. Are they going to react, and how are they going to react, and how trustworthy are you of their capabilities? And maybe you end up having to ask them, what, we would prefer you not to bring your weapon in a church. And, they can make that decision or not. And then you kind of have to deal with those consequences. But those are just a couple other quick thoughts.
No, that's a great idea on the tabletop. And I can tell you, we had an incident in our church recently. I'm on the church security team, and I actually didn't ask to be on the team, kind of recruited onto the team. But one of our team members is a active police officer, and he sits generally every Sunday about 2 to 3 rows back from the pastor. So he's very strategically positioned. We all kind of try to sit in the same place, like you just said, Paul. But one Sunday, I didn't see it, but he told me after the service, he said, man, this young guy, about 20, was sitting in the front row. He pulled a knife out. In my community, it's not unusual. Somebody pulls a knife out, cleans their fingernails, sharpens a pencil. But he tunneled in because he wasn't doing any of those things. And he just kept playing with the knife and playing with the knife. And he didn't know this young guy. And, the whole time he's thinking, this guy is about 6 to 8 feet from the pastor. he'll be on top of the pastor and attacking him and could stab him multiple times before I could ever get there. So, at the point he started to get up and move over and sit down behind him and just tap him on the shoulder and say, "Hey, I need to talk to you outside for a second." He folded it up, put it back in his pocket, situation diffused. But it's just, understanding where you're at, where you're seated, being able to manage and see and control. And the tabletop exercises go a long way toward really thinking through different scenarios, and keeping it fresh in the security team's mind. I would go along the lines of, as you're creating a security team or you have a security team, or, based on COVID, I know one thing, we work with thousands of churches and insurance carriers that, provide, insurance to churches. There's a lot going on with COVID, coming out of COVID. Some of your volunteers, you're going to be recruiting volunteers. You may be recruiting some security team members, people that aren't coming to church anymore. They're doing it virtually. As you're starting to recruit, really looking at that diversified team, right? We've talked about law enforcement or military, thinking through fire, EMS, doctor, nurses, who are some key folks and key team members that you want to recruit in your congregation. But I would also say not everybody that applies is qualified. There's a lot of people attracted to security positions, to law enforcement, to these type of opportunities that do not necessarily fit in this environment. I know traditionally in law enforcement agencies, half the people that apply immediately are not qualified. And so don't be afraid to say no. And, make sure that, just like when we talk to a church, doing a very comprehensive vetting process for those working and having any kind of access to children, we need to be providing the same kind of vetting with anybody that we may be recruiting onto our security team, just to ensure that we have the right people on the team. So what can we do? What are, in the last couple slides here, where do we go with this? What do we want to do? I can tell you, Paul and I both come out of pretty unique environments. I would say traditionally, law enforcement as a whole, my father was state police, my brother's still law enforcement, older cousin, grandfather, my wife was 20 years in law enforcement. So I come from a long line of policing. But I would also tell you that most law enforcement is not preventative in nature. Where Paul and I think really clicked is I came out of a specialized program we built in Nashville that was completely prevention based. We wanted it to never happen. We spent an enormous amount of time early in the process to prevent, the domestic murders. And I know Paul comes out of a Secret Service environment where they spend an inordinate amount of time and energy on the prevention side to keeping protectees safe. And so, creating, getting your church left of bang. That's a military term. There's actually a book out there. Some of you, if you haven't read it or are not familiar with it, jump on Amazon when we get off here and, type that in. It's a small book, but it's a really interesting book, and take that book in context with what you're trying to do within your church to move the discussion, to move everything you're doing left of an event. Bang is when something happens. We want to be left of that. We don't want to, we don't want it to get to bang. And so it's a military philosophy. And much of this was around the change in how wars were being fought when you started to get into urban environments, like when we went into Iraq. Now it's very hard to distinguish who's the enemy, who's not. So it becomes very behavioral based. So, the other part I would say is, creating that culture in the church of prevention-based culture, that violence is preventable. When I started in law enforcement, there was this misconception that you can't prevent murder, you can't prevent violence. These are crimes of passion. We know a lot more today than we did 20 some years ago when I started in law enforcement. We know that that's not true. That's why we saw these numbers of, especially domestic fatalities in Nashville drop by more than 50%, because they are preventable. Talk to Paul, look at the most recent Secret Service guide, I think, that came out in the fall of 2019, dealing with schools and active shooters. the Secret Service didn't say you can prevent some of these, or occasionally you'll be able to prevent these. The director of the Secret Service said, these are preventable events and these are the reasons why. And it walks through all of the behaviors and red flags and things that, if seen early, can stop these things from happening. I would say this is a perfect time, when some of you may still be virtual, some of you may be hybrid, um, to conduct a vulnerability assessment. And we've been asked for years about, vulnerability assessments for churches. Typically, vulnerability assessments have been very expensive because there's a lot of labor involved in that. And Paul and I have been noodling on this for several years. As a matter of fact, pre-COVID, we were talking about it for schools. How can we do these virtually? Well, we can, and we are developing a tool right now that we will be able to provide to churches, schools, or any organization really, but it will guide you through a complete 360 vulnerability assessment. We can assist with that in terms of reviewing information, uploading different pictures. We'll guide you through that process, but it can be done now for a lot less than what it would cost to bring a whole team of experts on site to do the same exact thing. And then really looking at everything related to your organization. This is not just an active shooter assessment. I mean, this is really looking at, the active shooter piece, the security pieces, the policies, screening, cyber, SEPTID. This is the crime prevention through environmental design. Are there things, around the front door, taking in all these factors to create a roadmap of things that you can do to remove some of these vulnerabilities and move the needle toward reducing risk in the organization. And this last slide really provides kind of the 360 model and how this works in kind of circular fashion. I mean, it really starts on the recruiting side as you're recruiting, the team members, be it with the children, with the security teams. Background checks are not background checks. I can tell you right now, I've been doing this for 16 years. And on the church side, there is a lot of junk that is sold to churches that, the majority of what I see sold to churches on a background check, these national criminal single database type checks, will not hold up. They will not even keep sex offenders from getting through the cracks. And so, knowing how to do background checks, what's the best practices, how do you manage this process, the volunteer management and management systems, and, getting to the reference checks. If we know 80% of sex offenders that want to work with our children have never been convicted of a sexual offense, a criminal background check alone is not going to flag them. So we need to be looking at, ways of doing reference checks, and, there's software like RefLink that does that. Arrest Alert. We've created a solution now where we've integrated with jails across the United States. Not only can you do a background check, but for like $1.50 a year a volunteer, we can give you a real-time notice if they get arrested anywhere in the United States. So you can remove access immediately. And so it's not 2 years later when you do another background check before you find that particular offense that had happened. Learning, the training. We've got a continuous learning hub that we're rolling out where, a lot of your training, the idea of gathering people on a Saturday morning to do training doesn't work anymore. We're all busy. Now we're talking about COVID on top of that. And so, looking at the children's safety policies, what are the, model policies? How do we better keep kids safe? Managing visitors, vendors, volunteers, mentioned the virtual security assessment. And the last piece is this digital piece is, really looking at the cyber aspect of keeping your church safe. And there's kind of two tracks there. One, you've got kind of the internal, what systems are you using and how do you protect them? And now as we've moved into these hybrid and virtual environments, both as churches and schools especially, and we'll continue down that road. I think we found on the church side, no different than what we found on the school side, that there's going to be a virtual component moving forward. But how are we securing those? How are we protecting those? And so we've brought in a team that can help with the whole digital aspect of making sure your environments are secured from hackers or those that may, try to disrupt your systems or ransomware or anything along those lines. I know we covered a lot really quickly. We ran over a few minutes, but I'm going to pause there. Paul, you got any final thoughts? At the same time, happy to entertain any questions you might have, and I'll check that, Paul, while you give any final thoughts you might have.
Sure. Like one thing I think is important is that I think churches are in a unique position. You know your parishioners very well. And so take advantage of what you know. It's really helpful to know folks that are in your church that are going through difficulties, lost a job, going through a divorce, loss of a loved one, things that might trigger people, folks that might be going through some mental illness, know that stuff about your parishioners. You already do, for the most part. So take advantage of that stuff, and obviously be reaching out to those folks, but always check on them to see how they're doing, because that could be a trigger for something. And it's also helpful then, if you're able, depending on how your church is set up, with that kind of knowledge, people that do know the parishioners, have a couple of those people out front of the church welcoming them in. I mean, no one will be suspicious of that, because that is very, very customary for churches. But those people can serve a couple different roles. They're welcoming everybody into the service, but also they're checking out to see if something looks unusual. Maybe it is that person that just went through, a difficult divorce, and they know that their ex-wife also still attends that same service, and this individual oftentimes attends a different time service, and all of a sudden he's coming to this one now. It's just little things like that. That doesn't mean you're going to stop somebody, but but maybe you're aware of them during the service. You're aware of where they're seated, how. But when you talk to someone as they're walking in, it's very difficult. If somebody has a mindset that they're going to do something that day, and somebody looks at them and talks to them, you can get a fairly good feel whether that person isn't themselves right at that time. And maybe, it would be not unusual to ask them to step aside and talk to them and check on them. That would be, a behavior that would be pretty common for a church. So you can do things like that. People that you don't know that are coming to your church, not that, obviously you want to be welcoming and all that, but again, if something looks odd there, you pass that information along, or maybe you're the one that comes into the church and you kind of keep an eye on the back of the church on folks like that. But use that knowledge of your parishioners to help you in this, and then the tools that Mike described at the end, some of those can also help you in that regard.
Perfect. I had one question. Yes, we will have a recording of this. Zoom will automatically send you kind of a thank you email tomorrow. There'll be a link to it. We generally can get that up within about 24 hours. So tomorrow, hopefully it'll be up on our website. But if you go to safehiringsolutions.com, there is under resources, you can click on webinars. It will be there hopefully sometime tomorrow. There's also a Safe Ministry page on Safe Hiring Solutions. It provides a lot more information. Want to thank you for taking time out of your day. I know we went over a little bit, and I apologize for that. I know you're busy. We appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, want some more information, here's all my contact information. Otherwise, we appreciate what you're doing, and have a great afternoon.